Michael Meacher, as many of you know, is a British Labour politician. He's been a Member of Parliament for Oldham West and Royton since 1997. And he's also been Minister of State for the Environment from 1997 to 2003. Michael Meacher is one of those unique and wonderful politicians who speaks out and stands and walks on the other side of the road when he believes that something is wrong. And he's done it quite a few times. He spoke out on genetically modified food, the 2003 Iraq War, and also he raised important questions over 9/11. So I'm absolutely delighted to invite Michael Meacher to step up to the podium. He has asked a very important question that I read on his blog, and that was whether or not we have actually gotten to the point that we have to question existing systems because the change that we have will only happen if we're compelled to do that. The question was, is there anything at all which can make that happen? So, Michael Meacher, thank you.
Well, I think we were exceedingly privileged to listen to as brilliant an exposition of the problem that we face in our world as I have heard for a very, very long time. I agree with every single word of it. I think it is an exceedingly powerful argument that there is no question that we are directed on a course which is utterly unsustainable and which within 2 or 3 centuries, and I don't think that's an exaggeration, is going to lead to the 6th mass extinction on our globe. There have been 5 in paleohistory. This is the first time that the species who are going to be its victims are also those who've caused it. That is us. And the obvious, blinding question, which everything that Polly said leads to, is since the arguments are irrefutable and the evidence is absolutely certain and indubitable, why don't we do it? And that's what I will try to answer. Because my reading, I suppose there are optimists and pessimists. The definition of a pessimist is someone who has to live with an optimist. I like to be an optimist, but I must say I am actually quite pessimistic about the human condition. And one of the dreadful impressions which I have after a long period in politics is that whilst people know what needs to be done, whether as individuals or as nations or as governments, what tends to determine it is the self-interest of the powerful. And that is the fundamental problem. How do we get those who run the world to behave in a different way in accordance with what Polly was saying and to stop the ecocide that we're about to bring about? Now, I'm going to talk particularly about peak oil. The scale of change in the world economy over the next few decades is nothing less than apocalyptic. If we are going to save our whole civilization from the kind of destruction that Polly was referring to. And all of that has got to take place in a fairly short period of time. Why? Because we live and have lived, particularly in this last century, in an oil economy. I cannot impress too much on you the significance of our dependence on oil. We use it, of course, for industry. We use it for agriculture, industrialized agriculture, which feeds now 6.9 billion people on this planet. We use it, of course, for transportation, obviously, for cars and planes. And, of course, we use it, as it happens, for our military capability. That's the one area where, if we don't have oil, the results might be quite good. But the real problem is that we use it for everything else which is fundamental to our civilization. And I invite you to think what would happen if we didn't have oil. Now, you might think, well, that's a bit scaremongering because actually there's plenty of it. Well, let me just very quickly give you the facts. There is, according to all the best estimates of people within the oil industry and outside, something of the order of 2.5 trillion barrels of oil available. It was first drilled in Pennsylvania in 1859. We've used it for 150 years, mainly in the last century rather than the first 50 years. And of course, the use of it has been increasing all the time. We've used up about half of it. So you might think, well, we've got another 150 years to go, so let's not worry too much. Well, the problem, I'm afraid, is not like that. The supply is rigid. We will discover more than we know at the moment, but very, very little, for reasons I'll explain. But the real problem is that whilst the supply is largely fixed, the demand from the economies China and India, and don't forget that China and India account for 2/5 of our entire world population. And if you get those economies growing at a rate of 10% a year, as both of those have been and will continue to do, even in the recession which we're in at the present time, the demand curve is going up very sharply at the same time as the supply curve is more or less stationary. Even if we were to discover another oil field as large as the world's largest oil field, which is Gawa in Saudi Arabia, and that's exceedingly unlikely that we will do this because of improvement in geological techniques, it would only provide for oil for a further 10 years. We are facing the end of oil. Won't come immediately. Probably it'll begin to tail down quite sharply after 30, 40 years, and after 50, 60 years, there won't be that much left. So what needs to be done? It's very obvious that we should turn off the taps, like Polly's last slide. Now, market forces, of course, tend to do that. Market forces will be exerted. We've already had sharp spikes when there are sudden, very rapid increases in demand, but they're not going to work to prevent abrupt dislocations without very powerful accompanying strategies which are going to be enforced in the face of the vested interests. Everything that I'm saying tonight is about the vested interests that actually dominate the world. And I would say that was finance, it's oil, and it's armaments. Those are the three absolutely overwhelming economic, political, and military forces which dominate our world. Now, what is going to make us, and I'm afraid that is the word, it's not a rational consideration, what's going to force us to change? Well, certainly the oil price. The oil price today is touching $90 a barrel. It reached a peak of just under $150 a barrel about 3 years ago, just before the crash. If we hadn't had the crash, the financial crash and the recession, that price would probably be somewhere between $150 and $200 a barrel, and steadily rising. It's been brought down by the recession, but of course it will in time begin to go up again. That is good in one sense because it's going to force us to think of alternatives to oil. It's going to be thoroughly bad for the great majority of countries who are oil dependent. Don't forget it's a very small number of countries in the Middle East in particular, and a few others as well, Venezuela, Nigeria, etc., which do have a great deal of oil, but it's mainly in the Middle East. And the vast majority of the poor countries in the world have no oil at all. So it's a question of a balance. Now, the rational answer to all of this is very clear. The oil supply is going down relative to demand, and therefore we shouldn't be using more than the availability, or I suppose the annual depletion rate is what I'm referring to. That is annual production as a proportion of what is left. That is about 2.5% a year. We shouldn't be using more than 2.5% a year. Now, over what we were doing before. As I say, if you have 10% growth, you use considerably more than 10% in terms of oil, because oil is such an important part of production.